panel session on salmon farming in Scotland, growth and sustainability. I am chairing this meeting in the absence of our chair this morning. My name is Kirstine Sullivan, and I would like to welcome our panel of witnesses this morning, and I'll pass over to them just now to introduce themselves.
I'll start. I am Sean Black. I am the Senior Scientific Officer for Aquaculture at the RSPCA.
Thank you very much, Sean. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. I'm Sarah Evans, and I'm an Aquaculture Policy Officer with the Marine Conservation Society.
Many thanks, and can I thank you for making the time to join us this morning. I am going to move on quickly. I'm aware of time and there's a lot to get through. We have a number of questions for you this morning, and I am going to start asking if you can briefly outline the overall position that your organisations take in relation to the salmon farming industry in Scotland. Sean, I'll pass that to you first of all.
Yeah, thank you. So our position in relation to salmon farming is, as the RSPCA, we work to, my department, the Farm Animals Department, work to improve the lives of farm animals in the UK, and that does include farmed fish, so both Atlantic salmon and rainbow trout. We do this primarily through two different mechanisms. One is to advocate for legislative change where necessary, and the second way that we work to improve the lives of farm animals is through the development of welfare standards. So we work to create, develop and update welfare standards for Atlantic salmon. So that is our kind of position. That is our all we do is to develop these welfare standards, and then they are implemented on farms in Scotland for Atlantic salmon through the RSPCA assured scheme, which is a welfare assurance scheme. They will go onto farms and audit these farms against the welfare standards to ensure that they are being upheld. So that is how we interact with the industry. Our position is always to be pushing for more change as it relates to welfare, and to be ensuring that farmed fish live the best possible lives while they're in farms in the UK.
Thank you very much, Sean, and I'll pass over to yourself, Sarah.
Yes, so the Marine Conservation Society is an ocean conservation charity. So our role is to try and make aquaculture into a responsible source of seafood. We want to work with the industry and see that it works in harmony with nature. So in particular for Scottish salmon farming, we see that it has a future. But recognise that the current status quo is not really an option for its future development, and we'd like to work with it to implement changes.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And following on from that, the Marine Conservation Society has previously described salmon farming as a data-poor industry. Do you think there's still gaps in the data about the industry's practices and performance that you would like to see rectified?
Yes, I think we need to recognise that data in the salmon farming industry needs to be available, consistent, and it needs to be able to be used by decision makers with confidence. What we would really like to see for data in the salmon farming industry is for one repository for all of the data. We need it to be using consistent units. It needs to have common terminology available. And at the moment, we think that can be lacking in certain areas, particularly between the different sort of regulatory bodies in the media that are reporting on it. I think there can be a little bit of confusion about what's actually happening within the industry. I think the Scottish Aquaculture website is quite a good opportunity for that to be done, although that website would need development.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And Sean, if I can come back to yourself, just touching on the points that you made about welfare standards. So I note that the RSPCA's president, Chris Packham, has publicly raised concerns about fish farming and farmed fish welfare. Does the RSPCA share those concerns?
Well, the The RSPCA is proud to have Chris Packham as its president, but the comments that he made at that time were in a personal capacity and are not reflective of the RSPCA. We do want to improve the lives of all animals, and particularly farm animals. There are challenges for all farm animals in the UK, not just farm fish, but we do want to see further improvements over time. That's why we are involved. If everything was hunky-dory in any farmed animal industry, we wouldn't have to be pushing for further changes. So we do want to see big improvements across all farmed animals, and that does include farm fish, and that is why we have the welfare standards and why we work tirelessly in this area to drive forward improvements and to identify gaps in knowledge and to work to improve that over time.
Thank you very much. I'll now pass over to Elaine Stewart.
Thank you. This question's for Sarah. I've got 3 questions, Sarah. They're for you. In 2018, the Scottish Parliament's Environmental, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee concluded that excluding fish farming could cause irrecoverable damage to Scotland's marine environment. Is that still true today?
Sorry, are you asking if excluding salmon farming would cause damage?
Expanding.
I think it's certainly a possibility. We need to recognise that the industry has been doing quite a lot of innovation in terms of the production system that it's using. What we really need to see is effective marine spatial planning to ensure that any expansion of the salmon farming industry is in suitable locations. And those suitable locations are going to be dependent on a number of factors, including the changing environment, the scale of salmon farming that is expected to happen, and the production systems. So there are certain production systems that might be more suitable in certain locations than others. So I would say that it is certainly a risk that expanding salmon farming could cause environmental damage, but there are ways to mitigate around that if they are taken properly.
Thank you. You kind of answered my question 2 there, so I'm not going to ask you that. What progress is the industry making to reduce emissions of chemicals and other wastes from the farms?
So the emissions of waste in the farms are controlled through a car licence through SEPA. So they are responsible for setting the limits that the farming industry has to abide by in terms of what they are or are not allowed to emit into the environment. So that's the primary way that it is regulated. The industry itself, in order to work within those restrictions, are sort of going through a number of ways of trying to innovate in ways to avoid having to use these chemicals. So an example would be for sea lice. Prevention is always better than cure, and that goes for every sort of disease or welfare issue that the farmed fish might be facing. So the use of cleaner fish is one way to avoid using chemicals, although they sort of have their own issues that would need to be addressed. The use of different production systems, we're not really there yet. It is something that is being developed. So the use of semi-closed or closed production systems have the ability to reduce the impact of sea lice. And if there are no sea lice, there is no need to add chemicals to treat them.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll now pass over to Harriet Cross.
Thank you, Chair. Morning both, and Beth, either can take this, but maybe if we start with Sean. The industry and the Scottish Government figures both show that mortality has been increasing in recent years amongst farmed salmon. And do you have a view on what might be causing this? And is it different, like nationally here versus what it would be globally?
Yes, so in terms of what has been driving the levels of mortality that have been seen over the last couple of years, primarily the feedback that we have received from our stakeholders and from RSPCA Assured is that a lot of the mortality has been driven by gill health challenges. And then that, in turn, has been driven primarily by new species of jellyfish that have not really been seen by the industry here in Scotland, but also different types of algae or plankton. So it does seem to be gill health challenges from the environment that seem to have been causing some of the mortality in recent years. There are other infectious disease challenges as well, but primarily seems to be gill health. In terms of how that compares internationally, these challenges have been seen in other locations. Norway, in particular, in some areas last year, had the same string jellyfish. I'm not going to try and pronounce its Latin name, but it caused huge mortality. And there's been a lot of discussion recently about increased sightings this year in Norway. So they are seeing the same challenges that Scotland are seeing. It's just where these countries are, kind of what their water temperatures are does kind of change the dynamics a little bit. But these challenges are seen in other countries. But it is primarily gill health in the last couple of years. But it must be recognised that challenges do evolve over time. And what we want to see is that the industry adapts to these changes and tries to develop systems that mitigate for these in the future. It's not kind of, as Sarah has said before, the status quo is not acceptable. So not adapting to these changes is more problematic than anything else.
Thank you. And then I guess, Sarah, sort of following on from that, sort of whether it's gill health or sort of other reasons why we've seen changes in mortality, what from a policy point of view have you been looking at that might actually help?
Yeah, so we would like to sort of look at the issue of mortality through a climate change lens. Well, we sort of need to look in the context of both the climate and nature emergencies that we're facing. And we believe that a lot of these trends in mortality are related to climate change. It's a contributing factor to the increase in micro jellyfish that Sean mentioned, in gill disease, in the life cycles of sea lice as well. And they're all linked to increasing water temperatures. So in terms of policy and what we would like to see, we think it's going to be important to cooperate and share data. This is not a Scottish issue, this is an international issue. But we also need to recognise that Scotland is unique in certain ways in its aquaculture of salmon farming. Compared to places like Norway, the water is typically warmer and shallower, so the challenges that it's going to be facing are going to be unique as well. So we need Scotland-specific research and Scotland-specific solutions. What we would really like to see is aquaculture integrated into climate change policies. That's sort of the key ask I think we would ask there.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a supplementary from our colleague Angus MacDonald.
Sean, hi. Can I ask you, in your paper, which was sent 1.11, it said 25% mortality a year, and in the Mowi and the Salmon Scotland paper, it said 2.5% per month, and obviously that's roughly the same. Is it 2.5% or is it 25%?
I think what we see is that mortality per month kind of varies. The months in the kind of autumn, your September, October, November, mortality does tend to be a little bit higher and probably north of 2.5% a month. Whereas then in the kind of early spring, late winter, when the water temperature is a bit lower, your mortality is a bit lower. So it probably averages out probably around 2.5% a month, which probably comes out about 25% in the last 2 or 3 years per year. Kind of to an earlier point that Sarah made, some of the data could be very confusing, as you have very well highlighted, depending on the different regulators that collect the mortality data. It can be quite confusing to actually understand completely what is happening. So while we take the 25% is a number that has been produced publicly, there are other, you could use other sources of data and come out with a slightly different number.
Well, I don't understand this, and it's a hugely important issue. If it's, just say there's 100,000 tonnes a month produced, and 2.5% of them die in that month, that equates to 1.2 million tonnes a year, just say, 12 months, and then that would still be 2.5%. So I don't understand the figure. Are we seeing 25% of all the fish dying, or are we seeing 2.5% of all the fish dying?
Sorry, okay, so the 2.5% would accumulate, so if it's 2.5% in 1 month, and then another 2.5%, it would be like 5% of the standard crop, so it's 25% of the standard crop over the year. So the 25% is a kind of cumulative, and then the 2.5 is for the month. So it's a different way of looking at the data. So they're saying 2.5% a month. That number that we have provided is over the year, so it's kind of a cumulative, and it will vary. So if that makes a little bit more sense.
I'm sorry, if I can just bring in Harriet again at this point.
Thank you, Chair. Just if I can clear this up. So are we saying that the total in the year is a quarter of these stocks die, and then you've looked at it, you've then broken it down per month in order to get to the quarter, or is it we've taken each of the months' mortality and added it up?
You could do either way.
I don't think you can do either way.
Well, if it averages out, I'm not sure about this 2.5% number that Mr. McDonald mentioned. I would need to understand where that number's come from. But what we are saying is we have taken that 25% based on the numbers that have come out of the Scottish Fish Farm Production Survey, which shows the percentage of smolts that make all the way through to harvest, and that is generally about 25% of fish that don't make it all the way through to harvest. So that's the number that we have used in that regard.
Use the annual figure.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean. And thanks, Harriet and Angus, for your questions. I'm now going to pass on to Maureen Burke.
Good morning to both of you, and thanks for coming along this morning. I'm going to direct my question to yourself, Sean. Salmon Scotland has said that Scottish salmon farmers provide the highest welfare standards anywhere in the world. Is that a fair assessment?
In terms of third-party welfare standards, the welfare standards that we have created as the RSPCA are continually viewed as world-leading. We continue to push the boundary as far as we can as a higher welfare standard, and a large majority of the farms in Scotland are signed up to the RSPCA Assured scheme. So in that regard, yes, they are. There's a little bit of a gap appearing over time, which is other countries are bringing in more aquaculture-specific legislation. So, for example, Norway has an Aquaculture Act. So in that kind of regard as how farms are held to a legislative standard, the UK is not keeping up with that. But in terms of third-party assurance schemes, then yes, the welfare standards created by RSPCA are held as world leaders, and many farms do sign up to those. So in regard to that, then yes, that would be the case.
Again to yourself, Sean, can the industry learn from practices abroad when it comes to improving fish welfare and tackling issues like sea lice?
100%, and part of our work as well as the RSPCA is to look abroad and to look at novel technologies. And we know many of the farmers are doing the same. So Sarah mentioned semi-closed systems and closed systems, which are being used or at least trialled in other countries like Norway. So we want to see Scotland look abroad, and also over time we want to see countries looking towards Scotland as well as a for best practice. So we think that data and knowledge sharing with other countries about how to tackle issues such as sea lice, gill disease, is the right thing to do, and we do believe that many of the companies are doing that, and it's certainly something that we try to do where possible. I have various discussions with people all around the world on how to advance fish welfare, and we want to see that done by all stakeholders.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Sean. Susan Murray has another question on the same topic.
Thank you very much, Chair. And again, Sean, it's to you, but thank you for both of you for coming along. It's to do with the individual standards for RSPCA assured salmon. 1,200 standards seems like a huge number, and an increase of 269 recently. How is it possible to audit all of these standards?
Sure. Well, the RSPCA assured auditors are very well trained, and they have a very good relationship with the farmers. So when they go on farm, they know what to be looking for. The farmers are very proactive because they buy into the standard and scheme, so they are able to provide the information that is needed on these audits. We also have such a huge amount of auditable standards because there is so much that we have to cover that is not covered by legislation. So a lot of stuff that we have in the standards are potentially stuff that should be set as a minimum in terms of legislation, but because there isn't any species-specific legislation in regards to welfare for farmed salmon, that's kind of where the standards have to step in. But it takes a lot of work from all stakeholders to make sure that those standards are being met on farms. And yeah, audits by RSPCA are pretty thorough, but they do find a very kind of low number of non-conformances on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll now pass over to Angus.
Thank you. Sean, there's another question which I'd like to put forward. It's basically about your, the assured scheme you have, and whether we should be enforcing higher welfare standards. And I wonder also if you'd like to make a comment about wild fish, because is there any chance that we're putting so much strict regulation requirements on the farm fish industry, but not on the wild fish industry, thus disadvantaging the farm fish industry?
That's a good question. It's probably slightly out of my field of expertise, which is farmed fish, and it's our area as well. There is, we do hold farmed fish to a high standard in terms of welfare, and that's because we feel it has to. We have concerns about some wild, I kind of assume you mean like wild fishery practices, but it's not our kind of primary focus. We are more focused on farmed fish.
If you go on a fishing boat, there's obviously no time scale to kill them, and the boats catch anything, and you don't have any of that requirement. And the farm regulation and the farm fish industry is so tight that I wonder if we're effectively in danger of driving the industry to places like Chile away from Scotland.
I see your point, but I think it's only fair that we hold farmed fish to that level that we do at the moment. These are farmed animals, ultimately, that have that are sentient, and they should be looked after. There's probably work to be. I think that probably does highlight there's more work to be done on wild fisheries, but that is not my area of expertise, and it's out of my kind of remit. But I think it's only right to hold fish farmers in the UK to those higher levels, and at the same time, we shouldn't be accepting farmed fish, particularly salmon and rainbow trout, into the UK of lower welfare standards, and we should be pushing people towards higher welfare farmed fish where possible.
Can I also make a disclosure, which I didn't do? I have a Highland Cinema in Fort William, and Mowi are one of the advertisers and supporters of that business. Sorry, I meant to say that before my question.
Thank you very much, Angus. I just wondered, before I bring in Douglas McAllister, if you'd like to add anything on those points, Sarah?
No, I think, mortality and welfare, welfare particularly, is not something that Marine Conservation Society takes a close look at. I think I would agree with Sean in that higher welfare standards is something we would like to see, and rather than letting them fall to the standards that are sometimes seen in the case of wild capture, we should be pushing for wild capture to be a little bit better. But mortality welfare is not something that the Marine Conservation Society take a look at specifically, unfortunately.
Thank you. I'll pass over to Douglas McAllister now.
Thank you, Chair. It's again on the point of welfare, and my question is to Sean. Notwithstanding potential suspension from the accreditation scheme, if any member of the industry breaches welfare standards, what enforcement action do you take? What's the frequency of sanctions imposed, for instance, over the year 2023? I'm not asking you to comment on any live cases. Is that enforcement action, does that fall on you, the RSPCA, or is it the SSPCA, or do you work jointly?
I'll try to answer your question as best I can. I don't work for RSPCA Assured, so I can give you a top level answer, and if there's anything further required, I'm sure we could get that. In terms of if members are found to have non-conformances or non-compliances during inspections, they are usually given a chance to rectify the non-conformance, if it's something like paperwork, it might not just be available on farm at the time because the manager's not there. In more severe cases where welfare seems to have been compromised, that can be, sanctions can be applied and are applied, and we have, or RSPCA has taken different levels of action against different farms, different fish farms, and also should say, other terrestrial farmed animals as well over the last 2 or 3 years. That has been taken, and sanctions can range from take remedial action to formal warnings to suspension from the scheme, and those have all happened to various salmon farms over the past 2 years, depending on the type of non-conformance. And as part of a recent review, this kind of grading of severity of non-conformances is likely to be a little bit stricter and more kind of enforced. So we both the RSPCA and RSPCA take it very seriously what goes on in these inspections and how they are handled afterwards.
Thank you very much. We'll now pass on to Lillian Jones.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, and this question is for both Sarah and Sean. How can the industry accelerate progress on reducing its environmental impact and improving fish welfare and mortality? Sean first. Yeah.
Okay. So I think we see the industry and stakeholders as well doing a lot of work at the moment to kind of cover all those areas. I think some of the areas is just simply things like better funding or putting money towards new technologies like the semi-enclosed system we're talking about that might reduce the incidence of sea lice. At the same time, we want to see work going on to things like artificial intelligence. One of the issues is obviously that fish live under the water, and it's quite difficult to see what's going on down there sometimes. So, by using artificial intelligence and camera systems, we can see better what's happening under the water, and we can track individual fish almost. So there's this kind of really nice work that we want to see just rolled out more, and more work going on to see that kind of being implemented on farms. But really, I think we need to see some of those changes to happen pretty quickly in order to see any potential growth or sustainability. I think, from our organization's point of view, we'd like to see a lot of changes before of current practices before we really, as an industry, ran headlong into major growth and anything like that. I think there's some work needs to go on to technology to see those changes be made first.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Sarah?
Yeah, so I think thank you for that question. There's a few sort of areas that I would like to cover here. So if we're talking about improving environmental impact, I think, again, I would like to say that we would like to see salmon farming incorporated into climate change policies, because they are already facing challenges associated with climate change and will increasingly do so as we continue. So that there's a few things that the industry can do and can continue doing to try and improve the environmental systems there. So the first one is innovation that we've already talked about briefly. That could be innovation in production systems. That we would like to see commercial trialling of semi-closed and closed containment systems, which need to be we need to have a high level of confidence that they are actually addressing some of the issues and not creating new ones. We think feed is another area where if the industry is going to grow, they need to continue to do innovation. So if we're talking about feed briefly, there is a reliance on fish meal and fish oil in salmon feed. And the industry has done a lot of work in reducing the inclusion rates of those. So fish meal and fish oil are relying on wild-caught fish. And if the industry is growing, even though the inclusion rates are down, if the overall level of feed required goes up, then the demand on fish meal and fish oil will also increase. So innovation in feed is something we would like to see. Progress on alternative ingredients, things like algal oil are increasingly being adopted, and there's work ongoing on other alternate protein sources as well to bring them into commercial use. The one thing I would sort of caveat that with is it's really important that when we're looking at alternate feed ingredients, we need to be careful we're not shifting the environmental impact from marine onto land. The other thing that I think is really key if we're talking about the environmental impact is for the industry to work closely with the regulators and working towards an ecosystem-based management framework. So this is partly down to things like increased data transparency that we've already sort of briefly spoken about. The regulators need to have access to this data, they need to have confidence in this data, and this data should be used in an adaptive way to make sure that we have the best regulation at any given time using the best available evidence. And this sort of fits into my final point that I'd like to talk about, which is marine spatial planning. The salmon farming industry can only sort of be as good environmentally as the locations that it's grown in. The industry, I think, recognises that it needs to work in harmony with nature and not in conflict with that. A healthy environment is needed to support a healthy industry. So ensuring that we have the right farms in the right places is going to be key. And where that's not the case, we would like to see these farms sort of being relinquished and those sites returned to nature where that's the most suitable option.
Okay, thank you. And my next question is again to both. Environmental protection and animal welfare are both devolved to the Scottish Government. However, could the UK Government also be taking action to support the sector's sustainability? Sean, if you go first.
Yes, I think it can at a UK level. I know there's we've been also involved in looking for the UK government to implement legislation at the time of killing for farmed fish. At the moment, farmed fish in the UK don't have species-specific legislation in the same way that terrestrial farm animals do. So we have been, along with other animal welfare NGOs, have been pushing for that to be implemented by the UK government. And I know there is work going on that, but we would really advocate that moves with pace, because having that legislative position actually there gives a lot more confidence to consumers that farmed fish are being treated humanely at the time of slaughter. And farmed fish are the second most commonly farmed animal in the UK, and there's currently this big gap. So we would like to see that filled in. I think as well, from a UK kind of point of view as well, it's things like funding opportunities. When there's funding opportunities go out to farmers, that where possible, fish farmers, salmon farmers are included in those opportunities, because as Sarah said, there's a lot of exciting technology out there, and it's just a case of, well, if things like artificial intelligence or whatever, that fish farmers can also apply to that, because what we want to see is that being trialed on farms, and then once it's evidenced, it's the kind of thing that we would be advocating for in the welfare standards, and we'd see the industry push towards. So if we can get that, if that's kind of at a UK level for the government, I think that would be really useful as well.
Okay, and you, Sarah?
Yeah, so as a devolved issue, I think the onus is primarily on the Scottish Government, especially in relation to things like implementing its vision for sustainable aquaculture. And I do think the UK is able to support the Scottish Government in that. I would also ask that the UK Government can do things like deliver the commitments it made in the UK Fisheries Act and the Joint Fisheries Statement, which included things like cooperating on sustainable development of the aquaculture industry. And that included things like using an ecosystem-based management approach. And it also included aligning more broadly with the UK's climate change objectives as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And on the back of that, our colleague Angus has further question.
Sean, sorry to come back to you on this subject of morts. So, point 11, you said morts are 25% annually, okay, in your paper. Now, we know there's about 150,000 tonnes of salmon produced a year. So let's take it as 12,500 per month, okay? Now, the industry claimed there's 2.5% of morts in a month, and that is 3,750 tonnes a year. So it's 312 tonnes times 12. And in your paper, you were saying it's 25%, and that is 37,500 tonnes. It is 10 times the amount. Now that is 1,125 tankers of dead fish. So either we have got an extraordinary problem of 25% dying, or it is 2.5%. And obviously if this was a farm with cattle or sheep, this would be an enormous issue. Now, I don't understand, I'm reasonably good at numbers. I don't understand, either we've got 25% dying, or we have 2.5% dying.
Sure, it is definitely closer towards the 20-25% over a year, Mr. MacDonald, and I think it's kind of the number or the kind of yearly percentage of mortalities in Scotland has bounced around that 20% for quite a long time, and I know the industry wants to drive that down, and we certainly are keen to see that driven down as well, and it's through the identification of what are the challenges, and I think that's what we want to see over time, is that's driven down. It's got to be remembered as well that fish are very different from terrestrial farm animals, and they have completely different life strategies. They produce a huge amount of eggs and so forth, because they have a very high mortality rate at sea, so in nature, so it's kind of difficult to compare apples to oranges if we're talking about like farmed fish against farmed terrestrial animals. So just gotta be careful about how we make that kind of comparison, but we do want to see mortality driven down, and I think perhaps Mr. MacDonald, the numbers can be very confusing, as we're demonstrating today, because they come from different sources, but we certainly recognize the 20% kind of rough average over the last 10 years as an industry, but that's also, I should note, that's not dissimilar to what's seen in other countries around the world as well. Norway's kind of around that level as well, but it's a case of we want to see it driven down and down and down, and we have farms on the RSPCA scheme that are around like 10% mortality over a crop, so we want to be aiming for how can we get all farms down towards that level.
Okay, I still don't completely understand it, but we shall ask the industry as well. Thank you.
I was going to ask if that is a universally agreed figure, or if there's some organisations recognise some figures over another, but I suspect we'll come on to that in our next session. So I'm mindful of time. We'll move on to Douglas McAllister.
Thank you, Chair. My questions are to Sarah. Sarah, I've noted in your earlier answers, I think it was one of your answers during question 6, I've noted that you said that the farms are only as good as their locations. I wanted to ask you, perhaps that is your principal concern, what your principal concerns are in relation to future expansion of the salmon farming industry in Scotland. Is it possible for the industry to expand in a sustainable way, and do we have those future locations?
Thank you, Mr. McAllister. I think that's a great question. So first of all, I think when we're talking about it, one of the things I would say is that responsible farmed fish need responsible inputs. So that is in terms of things like feed, that is in terms of effective regulation of chemicals and medicines, and it's also having a suitable location in order to cope with the inputs that you're putting in. So a big ask for us is recognising the cumulative impacts of all, not just all aquaculture sites or all salmon sites, but all marine users within a water body. And I think that's something that we are working towards, but do not yet have a full understanding of. So if we're talking about the future expansion of the salmon industry, I think that's going to be heavily relying on understanding the cumulative impacts of sites within that water body, and whether or not that water body is capable of handling any increased expansion. I think there are potential for further sites. One option is sites sort of in a higher active area, so with an increased dispersal for inputs that you're adding in. That could be things like having sites in deeper water. It could be in higher activity areas, although a lot of work will need to be done to ensure that we have the infrastructure and equipment that is capable of situating in these areas. We have covered things like health and safety and of workers that are attempting to go into these areas. We need to make sure that people like SEPA and the regulators have access to these areas when we need them. So I think, yes, there's potential for the salmon farming industry to grow, but I think it's quite unlikely that it will grow to look the same way that it does now in terms of open marine net pens, particularly in some sort of sheltered areas, different production systems, different sites, and a greater understanding of cumulative impacts are all going to be required before we can really answer that properly, I think.
Thank you, Sarah. And finally, Sarah, climate change, how big a risk is that to the sector's future?
I think it's a huge risk. We are already in a climate crisis. We are already in a nature crisis. And we are already starting to see some of the impacts, particularly around mortalities. I think feed is another area where we're likely to see impacts. In particular, the El Nino effects on sort of the South American fisheries are used to provide fish meal and fish oil have already seen shocks in sort of recent years. There's challenges that are facing now, and I think there's challenges that we're not yet sure of. So the industry needs to adapt, and it needs to adapt rapidly, and I think it's going to need support in order to be able to do that.
Thank you very much. That's come to the end of our questions for yourselves, Sean and Sarah. I'd like to thank you for joining the committee this morning and giving very valuable contributions, particularly ahead of the committee's visit to the Hebrides next week, where we will be visiting Mowi. So thank you once again, and I will now briefly suspend the session before the next session commences. Session, and I would like to welcome our guests to the committee. Can I ask you to introduce yourselves, please, from left to right?
Good morning, my name is James Park. I'm Head of Insights at Salmon Scotland.
Good morning, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Ben Hadfield, I work for Mowi. I look after Scotland, Ireland, Canada, Atlantic Canada and the Faroe Isles in farming regions.
Good morning, and thank you for the invite. My name is Anne Anderson. I'm the Head of Sustainability and Development for Scottish Sea Farms. We operate on the west coast of Scotland and in both the Orkney and Shetlands Island.
Thank you very much, and again we do appreciate you taking time out your busy schedules to join us here today. As I mentioned earlier, we will be paying a visit to the Hebrides next week, and we will be visiting Mowi. So without further ado, we're going to move on to our questions, and I'll start by asking you briefly to outline the contribution that salmon farming makes to Scotland's economy and the communities where the farms are based.
I'll start with that, if that's okay. The sector has around 200 active farms, each of those farms acting as its own sort of individual business. The contribution to the economy directly is in the region of £300 million, with an indirect contribution of in excess of £400 million, so getting towards £750 million each year in terms of positive contribution. We employ 2,500 farmers directly around the West Coast, Highlands and Islands. So really geographically remote and fragile economies. But the supply chain impact is we support a further 10,000 jobs across Scotland, impacting each constituency across Scotland.
Thank you. So, salmon makes up the vast majority of the value of Scotland's aquaculture sector, but Scottish Government figures suggest that while the sector's economic value has indeed increased since 2016, the number of jobs it supports has not. Could you give any information on that, why you think that might be?
I think the company that I work for, Mowi, is the largest producer. Since 2007, well, in 2007 we employed 400 people. Now we employ over 1,600 people. So the jobs have gone up considerably, but the vocations within salmon farming have become more technical and more highly paid. So we have an average wage through the sector of about £37,000. You'll see people that specialise in data management, in AI, in innovation, and it's moved away from a large number of staff working on the farms. But the value chain has expanded significantly. So when people want to criticise the industry, they often say, well, the number of people working on the farms has remained stationary or not increased, or even in some cases gone down. But actually the people working in this sector, which is increasingly complicated and involves processing and all the products that you'll see in the supermarkets over Christmas, the numbers have gone up dramatically. People don't choose to reference that because they want to present that this is a lower level of employment than it actually is.
So the number of jobs in the whole operation has increased, but perhaps the number of jobs in the actual farms has remained relatively stable.
Yeah, so if you go back 20, 30 years, it was a fairly simple industry, crofting based, large numbers of sites. Those sites have been consolidated and become more efficient, larger and more automated. But the sectoral employment involving things like well boats, service vessels, net manufacturing, processing, so it's a long list, that's expanded dramatically, and the value of that sector is incredibly high.
Thank you, and I guess you've touched upon this already, but what is the industry doing to help deliver new jobs in Scotland, particularly in the more remote and rural communities?
I think one of the key things that the industry has been doing is working really closely with the training providers, both in the schools and taking it right through the curriculum into universities, working very closely with Landra and increasing the number of roles in modern apprenticeships across all businesses. I think as Ben has indicated, the diversity of the roles and the range of positions that are now within the sector mean that we can actually access into every element of Scotland. Indeed, our supply chains already do. So every constituency in Scotland has someone that supplies into the salmon sector. But specifically around growing our own and bringing people through. So investing into rural education, working very closely with secondary schools in the areas that we work. Part of that, my own company, SSF, we've got about 35% of our workforce is officially designated as young persons, and we're increasingly expanding in that area with the introduction of more and more apprenticeship roles. I think one of the key thing is that that's giving younger people in rural and remote communities across Scotland the opportunity to return home from education if they choose to go into the academia. And it also means that you can have returners coming back from other sectors into salmon farming. That higher average salary is very attractive. It's very much essential to be able to support obviously livelihoods, and it plays a large part in our sector plays a huge part in mitigating depopulation. I think one of the key challenges in all of this is, as Ben has indicated, we've got farms that are spread across the west coast and then across all of the islands areas, and identifying, growing those farms, consolidating can also mean concern in terms of loss of roles. But this is about very much strengthening, building resilience, to make sure that we're retaining and growing each of those communities that we're such a central part of ourselves. We perhaps don't talk enough about what we do at a local level, but definitely in terms of educating and bringing individuals into the sector right from the school age, and then supporting right the way through academia such that they can return back into those communities. It's absolutely essential. Yeah.
Thank you. I know that depopulation is a huge concern, so that's a really important point you raise. So moving on from that, can you tell me a bit more about the skills profiles of the jobs that the sector supports in these communities, and is technology actually affecting the kind of jobs that are now available?
Yeah, so there are about 75 vocations that you can take within aquaculture. Obviously, finance, the technical side, veterinary health, farming, both in freshwater and seawater processing. It's a long list, but you could encapsulate it into about 75 positions. And then, we employ everyone from people with PhDs or specialist processing, biotechnology knowledge, to people that want to work and use their skills out on a farm, a very hands-on job. We employ a lot of people in Scotland, and principally when people come and work, they stay with the companies. So I think all the companies really that will experience a more than 15-year average turnover, in some cases much longer. So people stay, work, maintain the Highlands and Islands. It's a very important industry which pays quite well in a remote area.
So quite a broad skill set required, as you would see in other sectors. How do you feel technology is driving the change in opportunities that are available?
I think technology plays a huge part right across every aspect of farming operations. So right from the process of assessing and identifying the quality of eggs, managing and monitoring water supply. We have remote sensing. We've got engineers that are supporting our land-based facilities, as much as engineers that are then out on our marine-based facilities, and engineers of different types of components as well. In terms of all of that. I think the investment into new technology, increasingly using artificial intelligence, to be able to support the eyes of the husbandry staff, whether in freshwater or in marine. So it's an additional support for farming life. The use of camera work, the use of remote sensing, environmental information sensing, both on the farm and remote from the farm. And then there's a huge amount of technology used to be able to assess the cumulative impacts of salmon farming in its environment. Again, whether it's operating within that freshwater part of the farming life, or whether it's in the marine. And so drawing on the use of remote vehicles, So I made a comment not that long ago to somebody that those that were concerned about their young teens perhaps constantly gaming would find many roles for them within salmon farming because of the abilities of that interaction with screen work and understanding and interpreting. And I think that's an area that has had a huge amount of investment, will continue to have a huge amount of investment, because fundamentally it assists and aids our ability to farm well, but it can never be a substitute for the ability of farmers to, in terms of that direct interaction with their animals.
Thanks very much, Anne.
Just to add, I think the range of roles across different sectors as well that are complementary or sort of supporting other manufacturing sectors or boat building sector, packaging companies. There's a huge amount of crossover into other sectors that without one or the other it would impact the growth or opportunity across different businesses.
Thanks very much for that. I'll now pass over to Angus.
Just for disclosure, this is the biggest sector in my constituency, and I know all the companies and I know many of the people involved, including Ben Hadfield. Would one of you, Ben probably, would in 2016 there was an indication from the aquaculture sector, including salmon producers, that the industry would double its sector's economic value by 2030. Are we on track to do that?
No, not really. In 2016, there was a proposal to try and double the value as a sector, as you said. Quite a number of people within the activist community, don't get me wrong, we regard them as stakeholders, but they wanted to present that as doubling production and doubling their version of environmental impact. That wasn't what was said. It was to double the value to the Scottish economy. It's already the largest food exporting entity by value in Scotland. So it was to simply double the value over time. We've actually slipped back in volume in terms of production. Around about 3 or 4 years ago, we produced 200,000 tonnes. We've dropped down to around about 160,000 tonnes because of the changes in the marine environment, which have increased mortality and caused us a lot of difficulty farming. We've had to innovate very heavily and invest to manage those challenges, not really caused by us, but caused by warming seas. And we're coming to a maturation of that investment now and know-how of how to cope with the issues that the higher temperatures bring, which I'm sure we'll come on to in further questions. And we see that production is increasing again in Scotland.
So do you see production moving to other countries, for example like Chile, to the detriment of Scotland over the next few years?
Yes, absolutely. If you go back 5-6 years, we had a market share of 10%. Now it's 6%. We see that the cost of production in Scotland is a lot higher than most other parts of the world. The regulation is very, very onerous and strict. I don't say that regulation is a bad thing, but I say that the exaggeration of environmental effect of aquaculture has precipitated more and more regulation, which has made the sector less able to grow and less competitive, and we're losing market share.
So the result, I don't want to put words in your mouth, the result is us exporting our food production away from Britain.
Yes. Yeah, and not just in salmon farming, but we see it, particularly in the QA, and as a background in regulation. Perhaps you want to add?
Yeah, I think what we find is there's a disproportionate focus, as Ben indicated, on that environmental impact. That then sets a tone in terms of and a confidence to be able to either expand on an existing location or to be able to move a farm into a more preferable, optimal location. Because the regimes that we operate under, the planning regime, the environmental regulatory regimes, are very much grounded in the thinking of 50 years ago in terms of a new sector. The assessment and understanding of that impact, it definitely plays a part in our confidence to invest and in confidence of our investors. So if you're looking at a global context and looking for certainty, which obviously as businesses, certainty is absolutely prime as we progress forward, then it can, that misperception on one area has a dire consequence in terms of time and efficiency to be able to either create and generate a new farm or to move an existing farm and to consolidate, as we wish to do, so I think in terms of the programme of work going forward, it's a global competition that we face, global salmon farming, but we also find differences within the regions within Scotland. So it can actually be perhaps easier and swifter because of the different way that resources are allocated and mindsets run in different parts of Scotland towards our sector. And that can obviously makes quite an interesting dynamic as businesses like myself who operate across multi-regions. Certainty, confidence is what's required, and I think we are still facing, as some of the questions I'm sure will be posed, that challenge around a misperception of the highly sustainable, fish farming sector.
Thank you.
I hope to be able to answer some of that later.
Sorry, just to add, I think in terms of what Ben's saying, that we're the largest food export from the UK, not just Scotland. It's based on a pull demand factor. So we've grown based on the reputation, the quality, and also the assurances that can be given. When we talk about exports, we're talking about full fish that are being exported. Customers want to see the quality that's produced around Scotland in great conditions for growing salmon. So we've achieved that sort of over a number of years, but we can't rest on that previous success, and we work very closely and engage very, very strongly with both Scottish Government and UK Government in terms of trying to make sure that success continues going forward, and that is through identifying the what actions producer companies carry out before putting any fish in the water, or in terms of environmental modelling and all the assurances throughout the supply chain that we heard in the previous session from the RSPCA.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now pass over to Elaine Stewart.
And you spoke about warming seas. Can I ask what risks does climate change pose to the industry's long-term future, and how can those risks be managed?
Yeah, so salmon's a bit like wine in the sense that it's farmed in two bands in the northern and southern hemisphere. So where you've got the right temperatures down in Chile, big production there. Same in Norway, across Scotland, and then Canada. So to put it in context, the temperature in the sea in June 23 was 3 degrees warmer than it was in June this year. That's a massive change. That's a marine heat wave which is going to change the environment considerably. So that brought with it algal species that we haven't seen. Some of them were toxic, some of them were very irritating to the gills, really they made of silica, they're very spiky. It brought with jellyfish that you would normally see down in the Bay of Biscay, up in the Hebrides of Scotland, and those stung the gills and irritated the fish and caused a lot of mortality. It's not just climate change that is driving that. I know a little bit about environmental science from my uni days, but it's having an effect, but it's also the cycles of El Nino and La Nina which are kicking in. So it's not going to get to the situation where you can't farm salmon in Scotland, but it is at the situation where it's harder to farm salmon, and mortality in what's quite a long cycle, over a year and a half, will increase. And this is the primary thing that's driving down survival in wild salmon numbers in the British Isles. So when people tell you it's salmon farming is having a big impact, potentially it has a small impact, and we're prepared to discuss that. But the principal thing that's driving down the survival of wild salmon is the same thing that's affecting the survival in our farms. And we just have to manage it and cope with it. When we did a previous inquiry, a member of the Green Party was pushing hard, should we stop salmon farming? Well, that's a great idea, isn't it? Let's just stop producing our own food and import it and import all our energy, and then where are we going to be? So the industry, sorry to give you such a emotive answer, but the industry has to just cope with this, invest, use the best possible people and the best possible science, and deal with the changing environment. And we can show you evidence today that that's exactly where we're at. That's what we're doing.
I suppose that follows on to my next question, which is about the industry working with academia and other partners to understand the impacts of that climate change. So is that happening just now?
Yeah, I can answer that, but Anne's probably a bit closer to the coalface than I am. So
yeah, I think there is a vast array of research and development underway in this space, and working with other marine users as well. So how do we better make use of the data? We have our own environmental sampling, and every farm has a very rigorous daily checks on farm and within its surrounds. But it's about it's how do we understand what's coming towards us? So that early warning, so the use of satellite imagery, the use of other networks and connections right down, the coasts within the UK. And I think, I think that the function of this committee and the roles that you have at a UK level, that connection between academia from all parts of the UK to better understand what is occurring, and the sharing and access to that type of information. To aid the knowledge, but also to ensure that we're not duplicating as well, so making best use of the finite resources that are there. I think there's also, obviously, in terms of this space, the locational aspect of where we farm, and we're getting better understanding of the consequences, our ability to react to those consequences, and therefore the actions that we need to take, which have included over the last 10 years, for example, my own company has followed 15,000 tonnes of biomass. Over the same period, we only secured 20,000 tonnes of growth. So largely remaining stagnant. But their decisions been taken year in and year out by farmers because we're recognising, in terms of the best places for our fish to thrive. And so where we move to and how we consolidate becomes part of that picture, backed and informed by science. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Now pass over to Lillian Jones.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning. In 2018, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, or SEPA, found that almost 1 in 5 salmon farms in Scotland failed to meet the statutory environmental standards. So what steps has the industry taken since then to reduce the impact of farms on local marine ecosystems?
I think if I go back to 2018, the measure of environmental compliance is actually quite different from the measure of environmental impact and environmental monitoring. So when that question of the 1 in 5 relates to the sector's fails in terms of reporting or record keeping, not actually to the impact in terms of environmental harm. So every farm is monitored. So we assess the seabed and the state of the environment that we're looking to place a farm in. And then at the end of every cycle, we're assessing exactly the impact of that farm. The most impacted area within any farm is that immediate area around our farming pens. And in the last 5 years, we're circa 98% environmental compliant with our monitoring of those pens. So there is as I said, I think it's important to understand what that standard relates to and that point related to.
So I think we can just say to you straight, it's a misleading statement. The environmental compliance of this sector is extremely high. The regulation is extremely tight and it's very transparent. The data availability, we were the only sector that publishes mortality, disease status, biomass. We all put very complex ESG documents together at the end of the year. This is fully transparent. People want to try and say that this is not a compliant sector because there is administrative, in a very onerous consent, you can point to things that weren't delivered on time. But in terms of impacting seabed, it's like 96-97% compliant, and that's after salmon farmers were allowed to produce a little bit more on the sites to manage through the COVID situation.
Okay. So to what extent do producers share best practice when it comes to reducing farms' environmental impact?
So every farming business has environmental colleagues within it. Those individuals regularly meet and share opportunities, and they share challenges, and they have the discussion with them. I think one of the key things is around sharing technology and understanding. And of course, critically for farming, is sharing the information that supports survival across all farms, because we're sharing the same water spaces.
Yep.
What is impacted in one place is likely to impact in the other.
And just a final question is, what role does Salmon Scotland have in ensuring individual producers contribute to the industry's wider sustainability goals?
Yeah, so we have a sustainability charter where I think there's 42 active ambitions or that cover a range of topics covering environment, people, communities, and so that's sort of an aggregation of each of the individual producers' ambitions in terms of mitigating impact.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, can I follow up on one of those answers?
Yes.
Because I didn't really fully understand one of the answers. If SEPA are saying that 1 in 5 of Scotland's farms fail the statutory environmental standards, if I understood your answer correctly, you were saying that that doesn't relate to impact or harm. What do the standards protect then? What do SEPA's standards protect that the 1 in 5 are failing?
So the 1 in 5 in 2018 related to SEPA ran at that time an environmental compliance assessment scheme that assesses every element of a licence. So there's multiple licence conditions. We heard about the volume of standards that are contained within the RSPCA assured scheme. So every licence will have in the order of about 60 conditions that are required to be met. There's a high element of reporting and exceptionally high element of reporting. There is a few standards that relate directly to our environmental performance. What I was referring to was around the actual environmental impact, so backed by physical sampling of seabeds and assessments of, environmental assessments of our water spaces, as you would more traditionally think of when you talk of an environmental standard, is around the actual space and its impact.
So to summarise, impact on the seabed was improved, impact on the water quality was improved, and compliance in that area improved. Around about 2016-17, there was an explosion in the complexity of the licences issued by SEPA, and the industry lagged behind in some of those reporting, and SEPA was critical of that. But in terms of compliance, are you damaging the environment? Actually, the situation improved. But the industry had to simply employ a lot more people to manage the burden of the regulation. So when I joined Mowi 25 years ago, there was one person working in the environmental department, and that was me. Now we employ 14 smarter people than me to cope with where we've ended up with SEPA. Yeah.
So if the licensing conditions, all these additional conditions, if they don't address seabed and sea quality, what do all these additional licence conditions imposed by SEPA, what do they address then, and what have you failed on?
Enormous reporting requirements to SEPA, and we're not failing on them all. What SEPA are pointing out is
1 in 5 have failed. So what are they failing on?
So in 2018,
yes,
1 in 5 failed because they failed to complete with submission of a reporting document within a certain time period, or they failed to provide a certain line on a 10-15 page document. There's a high volume of what you would term administrative and auditing reports at that point, as Ben's indicated. The licences became more complex. As an ex-environmental regulator, looking at those licences in 2018, I found them more complicated than some of the hazardous waste landfill sites I was dealing with at that time. So my reference to the seabed is around the actual environmental impact, and I think really important to understand the actual environmental impact and our compliance with environmental quality standard that's set in the spaces that we farm is in those high 90s. In our case, my own company, last 5 years, 98% compliance. It's also highly recoverable. Farming, like our terrestrial farmers, is all around that balance and ability to go back generation after generation. We have many farms that have been farming in the same place for more than 30 years. And I think about the Bruntsfield's definition of sustainable development, and it's the ability for those future to continue doing what we're doing now. And I'm very confident that that's the case based on the environmental information that we see for our own facilities and that we discuss across the sector. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to move on quickly to Susan.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody for coming today and for your answers. Earlier on in the session, we've been talking quite extensively about mortality figures, and of course the consequence of mortality is that there are dead and dying fish that need to be disposed of. And earlier this year it was reported that a company had buried salmon near a local beach on North Uist, seemingly without the necessary permissions. So in general, what reassurance can you give about the disposal of morts, as the technical term is not a problem more generally?
Yeah, so to answer the specific situation, the facilities in North Uist is called Whiteshore Cockles. It was a licensed burial site for fallen stock. You know, you have the National Fallen Stock Scheme in terrestrial animals, which is subsidised. In salmon farming it's not, and it's in even more remote areas. So they were licensed to bury mortality in the Maca sands, which it's not an ideal way to dispose of it, but it is a sustainable way. You're sequestering the carbon of that mortality into the sand, and there's no significant leachate, and it doesn't look pretty, and I totally accept that, but in terms of the right way to do it at the time, and that was a licensed facility. It's used by a number of companies, including Mowi. The owners of the site invested over 6 million of their own money into developing a circular economy to remove the oil from the fish and create biodiesel, and then create a pellet that could be burned as a fuel or could be used as a fertilizer. It has taken them an extraordinary amount of time to license that facility, and it's been very, very difficult for them. They have received licenses now, and the plant, what I was told, broke down, and they took a decision to bury some of the mortality in the previous landfill that was licensed. Well, their license ended in March, and they buried some in May and some other times, which they shouldn't have done. And I'll not condone that decision, but I do understand why they did it while the plant was back up and running to deal with the mortality that way. Some activists that were paid by philanthropy filmed it in May and then sat on that film and then released it 2 days before the Scottish parliamentary inquiry. So that's the honest context that I can give you. I think where we are now is the facility is up and running, it's licensed, it's producing biodiesel, and it's handling mortality in a much more circular and acceptable way.
Thank you for that. So, perhaps I could ask James then, in general, how are they able to ensure that the disposal of dead fish doesn't impact on communities and the environment, when clearly there are instances where unanticipated actions need to be taken?
Yeah, well, it's not my area of expertise per se, but in terms of making sure there's a as Ben alluded to, a circular economy in terms of well, no company wants to lose any fish, but when there's a mortality event, the need for it to be disposed of in a responsible or circular manner, so that rather than it just being a mortality, a byproduct's created from that unfortunate event.
Would the industry feel that there should be a mechanism put in place for these, what perhaps you would call it, exceptional incidents?
Yeah, we do you want to
Sorry,
go?
no, you go.
The climatic conditions have increased the level of mortality. It's not caused by salmon farmers, but we're the victims of that. So we've had to scale up both how we deal with that in terms of treatments for the fish.
Okay, sorry to interrupt, but it's more about when something happens. So this was the consequence of a plant not being available when it was anticipated it would be.
You want to come in?
Yeah, I can do, yeah. Across the sector, the process of managing mortality has obviously changed and evolved over years. So you've gone from having small incinerators now into an in-silage situation, where you're able then to make maximum use of that highly, valuable organic mortality. Increasingly now we're investing into, and there's a couple of businesses that support this within the Scottish landscape, both to the north and to the south of Scotland, to be able to then collect that product and then to utilise it in a number of different ways in the circular economy, not just for biodiesel, biofuels, but also increasingly, because of the manner and the investment into this technology, the potential for that product then to be a seed to soil, so not a fertiliser, because of course it is highly valuable. At that point, it might not be, the value we were looking for as businesses, and indeed, good fish welfare, reduced mortalities, high survival is, we're the ones that benefit the most from that, but ensuring responsible handling and management and movement. And so that process is now rapidly in play across all major producers within Scotland, and ideally marine-based, to ensure that answer and that question around communities. We are a marine business. We have vessels. Can we transport the mortality in that way directly through that process? And that's the steps that we're on to improve activities in that area. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I follow up on that
yes,
point? Thank you, Chair. The RSPCA advised in their written submission to this committee that they maintain mortality in salmon farming is too high, around 25% annually. Now, in fairness to the sector, the report also goes on to advise us that salmon farming is one of the most transparent industries reporting its data on mortality. But their written submission advises us that many other countries which farm fish develop legislation to safeguard farmed fish welfare throughout the life cycle, and the UK is falling behind these other countries rapidly. Would the sector welcome additional legislation?
No, I don't think we would welcome additional legislation on that. It's in the interest of salmon farmers to have the lowest possible mortality. Mortality has increased because of a difficult marine environment, which we've covered off, and we were amongst the first salmon producing nation to have full transparency on all the mortality data. I don't see how increased regulation would allow us to deal with this problem quicker. It's about investment, it's about the best farming strategy that you can have. And what you can see from the data, which is very available publicly, is that the industry has invested, innovated, and improved the level of survival coming out of that difficult environmental period.
You don't really recognise that comment then, that the UK is falling behind?
Oh, it was actually a bit painful to watch them explaining mortality, because it's relatively simple, and this data is published. So in September last year, the mortality of the fish held in the sea in the Scottish sector was 3.2%, and then in September this year it was 1.82%, so roughly half. In October last year, in a very difficult marine heat wave and dealing with that as a sector, it was 4.8%, and now it's 2.5%, so again, roughly half. It's not in the interest of fish farmers to lose stock. You know, it's how you lose money and go bankrupt in fish farming. Every element of profit is about trying to get the best possible environmental and quality conditions for your fish. But it's a very sticky message that fish die because of environmental change. That must be because the industry is doing something wrong. It's a sticky message, but it's incorrect.
Thank you. Harriet has had to leave, and she did have some questions on excuse me, mortality, but I think they've actually already been addressed. So I'm going to move on to Maureen now.
Excuse me. Thanks for coming this afternoon. I greatly appreciate it. Excuse the croaky throat. But James, if I could ask you firstly, that Salmon Scotland has said its members are continuously pushing themselves to go beyond the statutory requirements on fish welfare. What does that mean in practice?
So it's the regulations that farmers have to adhere to is already very high across Scotland. Number of different regulators, but it comes back from my perspective to the global reputation of Scottish salmon, and in order to highlight to customers, retailers, investors, of the quality of the salmon, we need to be at the forefront of salmon production, not just in Scotland, but ahead of the competition essentially. So making sure that we're pushing ahead with innovation, and it goes full circle in terms of if we're a successful sector, then more money that can be invested in terms of finding solutions to challenges that, as has already been flagged, we hadn't experienced micro jellyfish in the sector a couple of years ago. So these are challenges that were unforeseen, but as soon as they come around, the sector invests money in order to avoid that challenge happening again.
Thank you for that. I think that kind of takes in, the challenges which for the fish welfare is, what impact is it having on them with the rise in sea temperatures, and what you're doing to counteract that.
Ben is more expert than me on in terms of fish biology, but my understanding is that whilst there are the challenge isn't actually on the fish, it's the marine environment. Warmer water as the salmon can thrive.
We farm up in the Faroes, and it's just generally a very much kinder environment. There's a lot less algae and there's less jellyfish species that would damage the gills of the fish. Scotland used to be more like that 20 years ago, but as things have warmed, you've got species in abundance in Scotland which now cause a lot of challenges during the summer. Fish farmers have to innovate to protect the fish against that, so we use semi-closed containments like lice or skirts around the pens to deflect the algae and the jellyfish. We use aeration, we use bubble curtains, like a ring of defence around the entire farm. When it's really persistent, we can move the fish to other locations. In the last couple of years, my company moved 1.8 million fish in about 10 days, just away from the jellyfish, because that's all you can do. You're a farmer, you're here to protect your stock and do whatever it takes, legally and within the law, of course. That's what we do, and we move the fish. Anne, you're closer.
And I think we've done the same. I think one of the other things is that you can't move the farm when the jellyfish are there, so then you plan to move the farm. If it happens often enough, if it's happening regularly enough, and it's about finding higher energy water, so a higher current speed running through the farm. So if something does come into a farm, you kind of want it to get out as quickly as possible. And I think that's, that part of that evolution of and transformation for the sector as we progress forward is moving away from the more traditional sheltered locations, because once something's there, it's very difficult for it to move on. And you also don't have the depth for the fish then to, descend away from. So there's a sort of a current situation in terms of water flow and tidal movement that is advantageous, and a depth scenario where the fish can stay at depths. And that is supplement. So that's about the locational benefit of a place that then helps with innovation and investment and all the practical measures that we can do. But it loops back round to that very point. You can't move a farm quickly. And I know I want to move a lot of our farms into different locations and to consolidate. And we've got a plan to be able to do that. But we're very much at a point where, as a sector, if you think about the economics contributions we make, the social contributions that we make, and that high quality protein, low carbon, it's the lowest of the animal protein farmed products that are being produced. To be able to ensure that that's got the longevity, you need that ability to be able to move fast. I'm almost at the point in my headspace where I think actually salmon pen infrastructure is a real critical infrastructure as much as the roads and the rail networks. What would it look like were we to think of it in that way? Mm-hmm. Would we have faster movement?
Thank you for that. I'm not sure if the next question kind of goes back into maybe some of the comments earlier, but I'll ask the question anyway. To yourself again, Ben and Anne. Mowi recently confirmed that over 1 million fish had died within one production cycle at Loch Seaforth. While Scottish Sea Farms has acknowledged unacceptable lapses in fish welfare at a site at Oath Mill, what are your organisations doing to learn lessons from these cases?
Yeah, I think so. I took a series of interviews with The Guardian, and they were at pains to present that over 1 million fish had died in one site. It's actually one of Scotland's largest fjordic loch systems, and there are 3 sites in there. So, the mortality was just over 50% of the fish that were put in, and it was due to the string jellyfish that the RSPCA gentleman Sean referred to before, which is called Apellemia ulvara, but it's a jellyfish which normally is found at great depths, 200 metres plus in the ocean. And the last couple of years it's come to the surface and it's been pushed into the lochs, and it's caused the gills to be damaged to the point where it's killed the fish. So we suffered with that, and we did everything we possibly could to reduce the density, to stop feeding, to try and bathe the fish's gills in fresh water. And we did our absolute best for the fish, as you would, and we still experienced that very high level of mortality. So in terms of what are we going to do in the future, we're using AI technology to identify jellyfish species. We're using remote sensing to look over wider areas to see them coming in. We're using the bubble curtains and the aeration that I referred to before. And as Anne said, we're seeking to relocate some sites into less vulnerable areas. But what we shouldn't do is stop producing a very sustainable, high-value protein in Scotland. We need to continue production, and we need to find ways to improve the level of survival, which we think is the level of survival is not high enough in the sector. So every working day, all our teams are focused on that mission to improve welfare and fish survival.
I think having the opportunity to see the sector in person next week, seeing the because quite often the imagery of the sector is the net pens in nice, still, calm conditions, whereas the amount of technology in the background is quite amazing. With I think each year is in excess of.
So when you look into the pens, you mainly see water. In salmon farming in Scotland, it's no more than 1.5% fish, and the rest is water. But actually, in that difficult period over the summer, we may go down to stocking levels which are like 1% fish or less. So it's to give the fish space and chance to move around and shoal naturally. But I think, Anne, you were also asked for your view.
Yeah, I think think you were wanting me, you referred to the incident on one of our farms in the Sound of Mull. So I'm incredibly angry about that incident. I spend a lot of my working life going on farm to farm. And the practices that we saw there were not the best practice that we should be doing day in and day out. And I know that footage doesn't reflect what happens on those farms that I see. But the fact that I know that's not enough, the fact that it happened once is not acceptable. And the steps that we've taken across our company is to refresh, renew, reinforce and to confirm fully the RSPCA code in respect to the handling of fish, moribund fish, as was shown, and to ensure that all farmers have the equipment to hand at all times so that they can quickly euthanise sick animals. It's much more than that. It's not something that is reflective of the farms that I see and have visited in my years of farming, and it's not something that I'm expecting that in any way, shape or form we should be anywhere near. And there's actions been taken within the company, and we've increased and will continue to monitor to ensure that that does.
Thanks for that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'll now pass over to Douglas McAllister again.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is to James. James, what opportunities does the UK government's Brand Scotland programme present for Scotland's salmon producers?
Yes, I think the opportunity is significant. I think it sort of all goes hand in hand with sort of the upstream challenges in terms of regulatory process. So there's a lot of Scottish Government engagement that's required in order to make sure there's suitable supply. We export annually to over 50 different markets, and that's definitely a pull factor from those international markets wanting Scottish salmon, seeing it as one of the most premium salmon available. And that's something we want to grow. We're in the lucky position that we have greater global demand than supply. So, but opening up new markets is still something that all our companies would be keen to make sure that we get to consumers around the globe. Making sure that the supply chain is as fast and efficient as possible is key to that. To make sure that customers get fish in the most pristine condition possible. So we're working with the Department of Business and Trade quite extensively on trade negotiations and opportunities there. So given the balance of supply and demand, if trade barriers can come down, then that's very welcome. We're very supportive of the warmer relationship with the European Union, and looking to support any work that we can in terms of a future SPS agreement to reduce the amount of sampling that goes on entering Europe, as well as the development of electronic export health certificates, which would just speed up a process that needs to be just in time in terms of getting product to consumers. So I think the opportunity is there. We need to have the base of a good level of supply in order to meet those demands globally.
I would just to add to that, if you look at in the round in the last half century, Scottish salmon, it's an extraordinary Scottish success story, but it's also a UK one. Where Scottish salmon goes, UK goes, and when you think about the biggest exports, energy, whisky, salmon, in the US, you think about Scotland, for example, they'll probably say tartan to start with, but whisky, salmon, golf probably all feature there. I think for future, there's a vast amount of sea space. and we're moving outwards into it. Therefore, there's a vast opportunity within the UK coastal waters, never mind obviously our own Scottish coastal waters, for growth, and enabling us to put many more millions of plates of food, healthy food. Yeah, so positive.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So we'll just move on to the final questions from myself, and we've already spoken a bit about or heard from yourselves around the work that you're doing with governments, but can I ask what industry is doing to take advantage of the opportunities in emerging and high growth export markets, for example in Asia?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we need to produce more in a sustainable way and make all the improvements that we're challenged to do. But we need to be fairly knowledgeable about some of the attacks on the sector and where they come from. You know, quite a bit of this comes from the vegan sector, and whilst I fully respect the way that they want to live their life and the foods they want to eat, most people want to eat healthy proteins, and salmon's a superfood. So, you know, when you go to Asia, and there's 4.7 billion people in Asia now, they want to eat really healthy proteins, and salmon fits all those bills in terms of the nutritional profile and the health and the desirability. So we obviously want to tap into that. To come to answer the point, the US market is particularly attractive, and we want to do more there because the cachet of Scottish salmon is really high, and the price that you can achieve, that you get for the quality, is very good. The Asian market, which I referenced before, has amazing potential, particularly China, Taiwan, Japan. We also have a very, very strong UK domestic market. About 40% of what we produce stays in the UK, and that's a feature of all the UK retailers.
Don't think I can add much more to that.
Can I just ask what demonstrative measures or steps you're taking to really take advantage of these opportunities that you have identified?
Yeah, so we have to produce more in the best possible way, and we're committed to that. It's often there's this perception that we extract profit from Scotland, but actually the investment that comes in from foreign ownership or structural financial ownership has been really, really high in Scotland. So the companies believe in Scotland as a production area, but also as an area where you can get higher value for what's a higher quality product and has that provenance. So we're maintaining that journey, and then at the same time focusing on opening up new markets and working with government to try and ease the way a bit. Like Brexit was a nightmare for us. We had no option but to get through it. But it's made export into the EU much more complicated. If we can roll back from that and sort of ease the situation, then the potential in France, Germany, Italy is enormous for Scottish salmon, because it trades much higher than other origins on the provenance, the history, and the quality.
Was it fair to say, just going back to the first point you made about the produce having to increase? Is it that the demand is there, the opportunities are there, but you need to increase production?
So yeah, we about a decade ago we were about 10% of global production. Now we're 5.5% of global production. So in the last 10 years or so, the Norwegian sector has added on an additional whole Scotland in terms of salmon production to their volumes. There's also been strong growth in Iceland and the Faroes as well. And so we need to compete internationally. The challenge we have in terms of volumes is that relationships and customers need to have their demands met. And so it's a case of if you're looking to open up a new market, you need to take that product away from from someone else, and relationships are an important part of exporting. I was in France last week at the UK embassy there, and I was told that they solely serve Scottish salmon with the Label Rouge mark, which was a great way to promote and serve Scottish salmon. So that was really welcome, a welcome ambition. And
so the simplest way to increase production is to reduce mortality, which is number one focus, and grow the fish a kilo bigger. That would make a big improvement, and that's what we're focused on. Yeah. But I think if the Scottish government really wants to help and support, and the UK government really wants to help and support, then they should evaluate the headwinds that the industry has been subject to over the last 4 or 5 years, and try and ease those up while still maintaining the highest standards of production and environment management, which is what we have in Scotland. It's much higher than the rest of the world. And there's often too much talk about are we doing it badly, what can we learn from others? Well, actually, historically we've done it fantastic. The product is revered in terms of quality, and so we just need to back ourselves and set about producing more, keeping more of that wealth creation within Scotland, and we do a fantastic job of that with communities. And in governments, both Scottish and UK, need to seriously think, how can we help this industry to succeed by taking down some of the headwinds? Because it's been too much over the last decade now.
So that takes me nicely into my final question, and if I could just ask you to be brief, I'm really mindful of time this morning. The headwinds, can you just be explicit in what you mean by that? Because my question was, how can government help Scottish producers compete with international suppliers such as Norway that you've already mentioned a few times?
So Norway has a scale that you don't find in Scotland, both in its environment and its industry. And so the way that we can compete is having provenance and higher quality and higher price achievement. So we've majored on that. The headwinds that have come in is, there's increase in regulation, partly in response to a fairly niche group of activism. And I don't say that their views are not important, we shouldn't listen to them, we do, but we shouldn't react by showing the regulatory teeth every time. And that's what regulators have been doing, and it's reducing the competitiveness of Scotland in other areas. And I work in salmon farming around the world, and I see that Scotland has the highest standards, the most robust regulation, should be more proud of what we do and just tone down the headwinds. But,
yeah, I would say that the biggest risk to Brand Scotland and to Scottish salmon within that brand, or Scottish salmon as part of Brand Scotland, is slow growth. I think we as an industry need to work better with our regulators and with government. I think there's aspects on both sides in terms of improving that relationship. And, having been on both sides of the table, I think it's really essential that we understand and really do delve in and address the points that Ben has made. But it's not really that complicated to overcome. It's just about investing the time to understand. The problem we have is brought to us within the seas. That impacts on everything we do. It means that we can be less efficient as farmers as we're then managing to deal with the issues. And of course, that then impacts on that bottom line in terms of the tonnage that's then produced. So we need to move, and we need to move in regulatory terms and move our minds around what this sector actually is. And I think that's one of the key things here, the value that it can bring. But we need to do it right now. And that movement and physical movement of farm and mental movement of minds to enable it really does need to occur. And with both industry, regulators and parliamentarians, that is a conversation we've all got a part to play to be able to deliver it.
Thank you very much.
Just finally, I think that we're hugely and quite rightly robustly regulated sector, and we support that, but I think there can be a huge amount of streamlining and efficiencies made, and I think that's been appreciated by regulators and government in Scotland. And I think we just need to be careful not to just become a sector that's exporting higher production costs, and we should be exporting on that price point because it's a justifiable premium rather than just because it's a necessity to export on higher based on higher costs. So.
Well, can I thank James, Ben and Anne very much for your time this morning and for the contributions that you've made. You've brought a lot of insight into the industry. So thank you once again, and I'll now bring this public session to a close. Thank you.